Coming up on Viz Asia, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang continues his three-day visit to India, aiming to boost bilateral trade and economic cooperation. 5 straight days of gains, Chinese mainland equities closed in the green once again. They're back above the 2,300 mark, but shares in Hong Kong fell from a 3.5-month high. And Goldman Sachs cashes out on its final tranche of ICBC shares, raking in $1.1 billion by selling its remaining stake in the world's largest bank by assets. Good evening, this is Biz Asia on CCTV News. I'm Michael Wong. We begin tonight with Sino-India ties. China says a strategic consensus has been reached with India to deepen mutual trust. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang made the statement after talks with Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh on Monday in New Delhi. The two sides signed a total of 8 agreements spanning trade, culture, and the environment in a bid to further expand cooperation between the two nations. Zhang Ningning reports from the Indian capital of New Delhi.
The two Asian neighbors have agreed to improve the mechanism for settling border disputes and reiterated their commitment to maintaining peace and tranquility. Premier Li Keqiang said that they had established principles for settling the issue. He believes they should further tap into common ground.
Both Prime Minister Singh and I believe there are far more common interests than differences between our two sides. We need to confront issues with a broad mind and tackle them in a mature way.
Special representatives from China and India will meet soon to seek an early agreement on a fair, reasonable, and mutually acceptable boundary settlement. Meanwhile, the two sides have signed agreements to increase communication on transborder waters. Altogether, 8 agreements were signed, from trade to tourism and culture. India's Prime Minister called for more mutual trust to expand converging interests.
It is important to build understanding between our two peoples. We agree that both sides must work to strengthen greater trust and confidence, which in turn will permit much larger cooperation.
The two sides agreed to cooperate on industrial parks, infrastructure, and other areas, work towards creating an economic corridor with Bangladesh and Myanmar, and to connect the huge Chinese and Indian markets. The world's 2 largest developing countries have issued a joint statement to deepen their partnership over a broad spectrum of issues. Leaders of both countries have agreed to look beyond their differences and keep their eyes on the future. Cooperation between China and India goes beyond their bilateral dimension and has a global and strategic significance. Zhang Ningning, CCTV, New Delhi.
Well, today, Premier Li Keqiang delivered a speech at a business function hosted by the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry in New Delhi. Premier Li stressed the importance of mutual understanding, saying that India is one of the fastest-growing economies in the entire world.
China and India are both major developing countries, and we need to increase the voice and representation of major developing countries in the international arena. We are happy to see India playing a more important role in international affairs. Representing 1/3 of the world's total population, our development and cooperation is set to attract world attention. Without a doubt, China-Indian relations are one of the most important bilateral relations in the world in the 21st century.
And for more on Premier Li Keqiang's visit to India, our correspondent Shweta Bajaj joins us from New Delhi. Shweta, so 8 agreements already inked. One interesting proposal, though, to boost bilateral trade ties is the idea of an economic corridor between not just China and India, but also with Bangladesh and Myanmar, because these are all neighboring countries. What more can you tell us about this plan?
Well, it seems that these neighboring countries haven't been used to its own, the kind of potential that they both have by both its other neighbors, India and China, which are fast developing economies. Now, for both of them to have corridors to these would actually mean that they can be used by both the nations. It would also mean it will be efficient for both the countries to do that. Incidentally, of course, Bangladesh happens to be one place where India imports a lot of cotton from, a lot of clothing and textile comes from there, and that would mean for India it could actually have a corridor to use it to have any sort of trade. Now, this particular particular trade corridor would also for it mean that it could have a corridor with China in the future to increase the trade between them. And all those 8 agreements that you mentioned, actually not just one, there are 2 others as well, which are working groups on various sectors and industry and are looking at actually increasing trade across spectrum. They are also looking at the infrastructure, which is growing very rapidly here in India. India is looking at investing trillions of dollars into its infrastructure, which is at this point in time, it's at a juncture where it needs huge amount of investment. Here in New Delhi, we have a number of projects coming up. A couple of them already have Chinese companies involved in it, and they would like to have a larger share of it. So both the premiers also talked about the fact that how they can increase investment. The Indian Prime Minister said that he welcomes investment from China, and Chinese companies would like to come here and invest in infrastructure. So that's another way of actually also addressing the concern of trade imbalance between India and China, because India imports many products from China. To have some sort of a balance in trade, Chinese investment in India could lead to some sort of a parity on that level.
All right, Shweta, we're going to leave it there for tonight. Many thanks for those insights. Certainly lots of fields for cooperation. So, folks, what's the media saying about Premier Li Keqiang's visit to India? For that, Jackie's standing by the board with the details. Jackie, take it away.
Well, the Premier's visit has garnered a lot of media attention around the world, especially as India is the very first country that the Chinese Premier chose to visit on his maiden trip abroad. Now, it's a visit that follows a recent flare-up in border tensions between the two. Let's take a look at some of the headlines. Well, Russia's international broadcasting service, the Voice of Russia, says that the Sino-India cooperation is not about bilateral ties between the two developing giants exclusively, but the greater cooperation will enhance regional economic development. Before Premier Li's trip to India, he said China and India should lock arms to make Asia the locomotive of the global economy. Across to India, where India's daily English newspaper, The Hindu, pointed out the significance of China choosing India as the first stop of the new Premier's state visit. The Hindu says it shows that China wants to further promote the strategic relationship between the pair. The business delegation that Premier Li is bringing marks one of the biggest delegations ever by China to India, including some of the country's top ministers and executives from leading state-owned enterprises. And finally, China's XINHUA news agency says as China and India are the two leading emerging economies among BRICS nations, the two can learn much from one another moving forward. Currently, India has advantages in the IT and pharmaceutical industries, while China is strong in heavy equipment and infrastructure construction. The agency notes if the two countries can focus on these synergies, more breakthroughs in bilateral cooperation will follow. Interesting indeed. Back to you, Mike.
All right, many thanks for that rundown, Jackie. Well, folks, in the past decade, Sino-Indian trade have risen at a very astounding pace. In 2002, bilateral trade came in at just a paltry $5 billion. Now, fast forward to 2012, last year, and trade between the two stands at a whopping $66 billion. Now, folks, that represents a compound annual growth rate of nearly 30% throughout those years. Now, these achievements have made China India's largest trading partner. In the next step, both countries don't simply wish to focus on just trade, but also on bilateral investments. Shweta Bajaj reports from India's capital once again and walks us through some of the challenges and commonalities the neighbors face.
China and India are looking at increasing their bilateral trade to $100 billion by 2015. But both the nations believe the potential is way more. Premier Li Keqiang's visit to India with an eye on increasing trade has given the hopes of increased trade a further impetus.
I think both India and China are two economies where there is a fair amount of space for catch-up, as they call it. So to that extent, I think both in trade and as a destination for investment, India would be a very suitable and appropriate partner for China. And the converse is true for India.
Infrastructure is a sector where both the countries have a huge potential. Shanghai-based SUCG Infrastructure has been part of India's infrastructure building. After starting its business in India in the year 2006, today it has contracts amounting to $1 billion. I'm standing in a tunnel being built by Shanghai-based infrastructure company SUCG for Delhi Metro. This particular tunnel stretches for over 2.5 kilometers. But as more and more Chinese companies want to do business in India, the fact remains that they do face a number of hurdles.
The Indian policies are sometimes uncertainties and fluctuations. because of such kind of uncertainties and fluctuations for the Chinese companies, we cannot make out our long-term development plan.
For India, the biggest issue is trade imbalance with China. For the same, China and India have agreed to make a roadmap to reach a balance that works for both. Shweta Bajaj, CCTV, New Delhi.
And to talk more about where Sino-India cooperation goes from here, we're joined in the studio tonight by Mr. Hu Shisheng, a director focusing on Southeast Asian studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Mr. Hu, thanks for joining us tonight. So I guess the main question would be how to better connect the world's two largest emerging market economies, namely China and India. Mr. Hu, we're talking about two nations that have close to 40% of the entire world's population. Both are developing, so cooperation between the two is huge, right, in many fields.
Yes, there are various areas for both countries to cooperate. For example, that infrastructure area, China has the